So let's now dig into the bottom part of our HR management, which is where we're looking at how do we build competent and high-performing employees who can sustain high performance over the long term. So this is where we're going to be digging into aspects of performance management, compensation and benefits, including salaries, and overall safety and health of the employees. So some large organisations, in fact, I'd say a lot of large organisations, use what they call a performance management system. Some of these track things like training, employee evaluations, these kinds of things on a sort of often on an online system. And they'll also often use annual performance rating systems where you'll sit down with your boss and you'll go through what were the goals for the year, did you achieve them, what's working well, what isn't working so well in the job. In smaller organisations, this tends to happen a little bit more ad hocly, where you may not necessarily sit down every year or quarter or whatever, but just that it'll be a sort of ongoing process where your manager or supervisor might give you feedback, and things will sort of happen more on a sort of day-to-day basis, and things will be kind of managed more on a day-to-day basis as well in terms of are goals being achieved and how are things going in general. More and more, we're seeing this process that we call 360-degree appraisal. So not anything to do with the 360-degree record deals, but as the name suggests, and as you can imagine, this is about trying to get a more sort of 360 degrees, so from all around, an appraisal of an employee. So the purpose of this is that typically performance management is only done by the person's manager, whereas a 360-degree appraisal is designed to get feedback from people who interact with whoever this person is in a variety of ways. So if it's me that's getting a 360-degree appraisal, it won't just be feedback from my boss on, you know, am I doing a good job, and what am I doing well, etc. But my colleagues will be asked to rate me, customers might be asked to rate me, any other people that I interact with in the organisation might be asked to rate me. And the idea here is that you're building up a more complete picture of that person's performance, and where they might need some more development. So for example, we might find that, you know, someone's really good at what we call managing upwards. So they're really good at sucking up to their boss, and making their boss think that they're doing a really good job. But in the meantime, all their colleagues say that they're a real slacker, and that they're constantly having to pull up the slack for that person. And so we're able to get a much better picture of exactly what's going on and where that person might need some additional development by doing this 360-degree. Obviously, that's a lot more time consuming. And so there are different ways of doing it using just, you know, feedback forms and, you know, surveys and stuff like that. But of course, we've always got to be careful that these things are reliable measures of what we're trying to understand about the person, and they're not just being used for, you know, other people to backstab them in the process. Now, this list gives us a few different ways of thinking about how we can appraise performance. Most of them are way too detailed and way too time-consuming for most people to get involved in. But let's have a quick look at some of them just to see what some of the uses might be. So we can write up, like, I don't think anyone's ever going to write an essay on an employee to appraise them, but maybe some kind of written statement that captures some of the key aspects of what's gone well or where that person might need to develop. Their performance could be useful. Critical incidents is where you are describing particular moments in time where things happened. So you might look for examples of where the person performed exceptionally well, Or you might look to describe an incident, so a moment where they didn't do so well. And you would then describe what happened in that situation or in that incident that is an illustration of the good thing or the bad thing. So you might start to say, you know, they were rude to a customer, or you observed them on a sales call and they did a great job when they offered this upsell to the customer, whatever it was. And so by doing this, you're able to anchor for the employer, for the employee, and for the manager or whoever is actually doing the appraisal. You're able to anchor it into the person's actual behavior. And you can do this in an ad hoc way, you know, when you just sort of observe somebody doing something either really good or not so good. You can say, hey, when you did that thing, it was really great because of this. And you're then articulating to that person what it was in that moment that worked particularly well. Or in contrast, you could say, hey, when this thing happened, next time, perhaps you could do this instead. And so you're giving them a really clear anchor and a very vivid understanding of exactly what's happening in that moment. That is either something they should continue doing or something they should change. Graphic rating scales are things like, you know, charts where you can kind of go through and go rate somebody from 1 to 10 or whatever on their, whatever the key things that you're rating them on, you know. Do they turn up on time? Do they do a good job? Are they nice to people? Whatever. Bars, I don't know what that is. Let's have a look. Some of these things are so detailed and complicated that I don't think we'll even worry too much about them. Bars combine critical incident and graphic rating. All right, let's pretend that maybe we'll use that one day, but let's also just ignore it. Multi-person. So the book actually gets into quite a lot of detail here on this multi-person option and these different ways of comparing employees with one another. So, and again, don't get too focused on the details, but just think about, you know, if you're managing a team, or if you're like the CEO of some big company and you want to find a way of actually understanding who's better than who and who's doing a really good job compared to others, this might be useful. So I've seen this in action. A friend of mine worked for a big company, big corporate global organization. And when he started there, they had this big sort of new intake program. And I remember him telling me that what they would do is with this new batch of employees, so let's say there was 100 of them, they would, over the course of that first year of their employment, they would actually rank everybody. And the people that fell at the bottom 20% of the ranking, when everyone was compared to everyone else, would be fired. So it's a pretty brutal system that they used, but it was all about getting people to almost compete with each other, and to perform and outperform each other. So the idea was that people would always be observing each other. They would have very clear idea about what the standards were and what they were being measured against when they were being rated and ranked. And so then as an employee, they could really strive for what was considered excellence within that company. I'll leave it to you to decide if that's the kind of method that you would want to work with, or that you think might be appropriate even in the creative industries, where it can be a little bit more complicated to try and rank what one person is doing next to another, and also to really codify and assess creative type endeavors. This idea of MBO, our book talks about this as management by objectives. So this is where we're actually measuring people against end goals, which is fine if we've got very clear end goals, you know, that are very measurable. Again, in the creative industries, the degree to which this is achievable may or may not be really clear. You know, it might be fine if we're trying to work out social media engagement, you know, and we've got statistics that we can work on. But in terms of things like creative output, how do we measure this sort of thing in terms of measurement by objectives? And then we've talked about a 360-degree appraisal, which may be appropriate and useful if we're wanting to look at someone as a team player, or looking in terms of their overall contribution to the organisation, rather than necessarily just their individual results that they're delivering. All right, so what do we do if we've got an employee that is not quite delivering? We can work sort of punitively or proactively. And so, you know, depending on the nature of the lack of performance, we may need to take discipline. So if they're, you know, if the basically trying to understand why is pretty important, in order to sort of start to determine what strategies might we take. So is the person not performing because their job scope is inaccurate? You know, they're being asked to do things that either they're not equipped to do, either in themselves, or they don't actually have the resources to be able to deliver. Or is there something outside of their control that is making it difficult or not possible to deliver what they're being asked to do? Or is it something that is within their control but they're not doing? So that could be just that they're not interested in the role. They want to do something that's different to what the role is designed for. They may have personal issues that are at play. So there's a whole host of different reasons why an employee may not be sort of delivering. And so depending on the nature of that, you know, fairly common sense, whether we want to sort of start by using carrots or sticks approaches. So sticks being discipline, where we would start to set in place, well, this needs to happen, or there will be consequences, which will be anything from, you know, disciplinary procedures through to them leaving the organisation. And more and more often what we see now, particularly because of the legal environment that is at play in employment, we would try and use some kind of coaching or counselling process in order to help an employee manage any performance-related problems and help them overcome them. So when we're talking about pay now, so in the creative industries, pay tends to be quite a complex thing. I did have a look and I couldn't find any really strong, solid data that would help us really understand what some of the parameters around pay and compensation in the industry are. And so as managers or as employees in the industry, I think probably the best approach to try and understand what a salary might be would typically be what we call benchmarking, which is where we would look at, you know, trying to build up our own understanding of what salaries are normally provided for different roles, and then within a kind of rough estimate, working out exactly what we might pay an individual. So we call this process compensation administration, which is being able to work out what's a pay structure that will allow us to attract and retain good employees, and provide them with enough of incentive for them to work hard, and ensure that it's considered fair, but also not pay so much that we're essentially wasting resources in the organisation because we're spending money that we don't have to. And this is where it can become a little bit complex, because we're talking about human beings. You know, if we're spending too much on, I don't know, photocopying paper or pens, that's one thing, but providing people with a living feels like a different kind of way to spend money. So this can be where it gets a little bit more complicated and difficult to work out exactly what you should pay people. So we have this notion of skill-based pay, which is where the salaries are determined based on the actual skills that the person demonstrates. And this can incorporate a bunch of different factors. So it's what skills do they bring to the role? What knowledge do they bring? What abilities? And ultimately, what level of authority and responsibility do they have in the organisation? Because the more authority and responsibility that they have, essentially the more valuable they are to the organisation, because if they weren't doing that job, those responsibilities wouldn't be being done. So we need to think about in terms of the overall value to the organisation. And we might even think about this in terms of the organisation's revenue. What kind of share of that revenue do you think this employee would be responsible for? And we might use that as a kind of benchmark way to think about how much of this organisation is the overall financial aspect in terms of revenue, how much of that is attributable to the work that this person does. And so we also have these ideas of like standard, stable pay. Some jobs, depending on the actual role that we have, some of them may be covered under things like awards. So a lot of jobs in the hospitality space, you'll pay people based on an award. For jobs that are more kind of full-time and long-term, typically the salary will be negotiated. And again, one of the challenges in the music industry is that we tend to have an oversupply of people. So, I have friends who work in the record companies, and they say that it's very difficult for them to get an increase in salary, because even though they've gotten more skilled in their job, there are so many people out there who would happily take their job that it then becomes very difficult for them to argue that they're essential to the organisation. And so career progression can be quite challenging. And so people can often feel quite stuck in their jobs. But we also have this idea of variable pay, which is where, a commission is a classic example of this, where you're actually compensated based on the job that you do. And this can be a real challenge in the music industry for freelancers. So I see this quite often with people who are in the creative space, and they get paid per job. So say people who are like graphic designers or any kind of artists, they'll get paid almost per piece of artwork that they produce. But a lot of the thinking that goes into it, a lot of the kind of creative work that they've, the years and years of development that has gone into them being skilled enough to create that piece of work. And also the thinking time that goes into the preceding the actual construction of that one item is often not compensated. So this can be a real challenge in the freelance space and in the creative and art spaces. This idea of being paid per unit of production for something that you do, because often the stuff that sits in around behind it doesn't actually get captured for you. And the other thing that we need to take into account when we're thinking about salaries and performance and retaining good employees is the idea of employee benefits. So these are the things that you get over and above your salary that are there to enhance the experience of working in that organisation. So in the music industry, typically this would be things like being in an environment where you live and breathe music is often a key reason that people want to work in the music industry. They love music. They just want to be immersed in music and it to be their life. And so people can tend to sacrifice salary just to be working in the music industry. Which, if you're trying to craft a career in the music industry, means that you might be competing with people who are happy to almost work for free because they just want to work in the music industry and be around music. The other thing might be flexibility, right? So it could be that working in the music industry, suits some people's lifestyles. You know, they may not be 9 to 5 kind of people. And so a particular benefit that might be of interest to them is that they don't have to have that 9 to 5 lifestyle. You know, it can involve more weekend work, more seasonal work, which for a lot of people can be a downside. You know, if you've got kids, or if you've got a partner who does work 9 to 5, then working a lot of nights and weekends, potentially being on tour throughout the whole summer, can actually create conflict and be a challenge in people's lives. So, you know, some of these things can be benefits or they can be downsides. And they can also suit people at some stages in their life and then not after that. But other things that we can think of is in terms of employee benefits are, you know, typical things in the corporate worlds are things like gym memberships and drinks on a Friday night or whatever. In music, it can often be things like, you know, tickets to shows, the community that you then become part of because you're part of this organization that is in the music space, all these things that are associated with the actual benefits of working in the industry itself. And so here's this sort of broad brush kind of idea of how we might think about what determines pay and benefits. So these kinds of things, so to a certain degree in Australia, pay is determined largely by legislation to a degree. So, you know, if you're being underpaid, you can sue your organisation at Fair Work Australia. So there is kind of ranges that we can work within, that then these other factors can either increase or decrease what ends up being your level of pay. So first of all, your tenure and performance. So generally speaking, the longer you stay in the job, your salary tends to go up, both in terms of the, you know, consumer price index, so you'll get an index salary increase, but then because over time you become better and more efficient at your job, in theory, your salary might go up accordingly. And typically you also start to take on more responsibility and get more authority as you spend longer in the organisation. The actual type of job that you perform, so jobs with higher levels of skills, jobs with more authority attached to them, more responsibility, tend to be higher paying. The actual type of business, so again, you know, in large organisations, you might end up with a sort of more professional salary that's benchmarked against similar kinds of jobs in the open market. So say if you, for example, if you're in marketing at a record company, you would probably be paid similar salary to someone who's in marketing for another big kind of corporate environment. So the job and the kind of business tends to play a role there. Unionisation. So generally speaking, there's not a lot of unionisation in the music industry, which may or may not be a good thing. Unionisation, you know, has worked for some creative industries like the film industry, where they've been able to get better rates of pay, and particularly better rates of pay and better work conditions for ad hoc performers. Whether that's a direction the music industry would go in, I'm not sure. The actual nature of the business, so is it labour or capital intensive? So the more people we have in the organisation as opposed to the more kind of money and infrastructure can play a role. The actual philosophy of management, so, you know, is this an organisation that is interested in paying its people well, or is it more interested in maintaining profits for shareholders and not as worried about employees? The geographical location obviously will play a role in terms of what are the salaries in, you know, any particular country. The overall profitability of the company, you know, some companies actually offer bonuses or additional payments to people depending on the overall profits of the organisation at the end of the year, etc., and the actual size of the company. So with smaller companies tending to be much less able to provide large salaries, and also startup companies, because they've got those more volatile revenue streams compared to larger, more stable companies that have more of a sense of their ongoing revenues, and so are then better able to predict what their revenues are, and therefore what the actual salaries can be of their employees. All right, so that was our examination of the HR management process and how we manage high-performing employees over time.